Hi weaving friends, in my last video I was talking to you about the monk's belt project that I'm working on for my new monk's belt on a table loom class that is coming up sometime in the not too distant future. But today I started doing something a little bit different on the same warp, and I wanted to share this with you because I think it's an important point. And I know that before I started multi-shaft weaving I had some preconceptions about certain things, but then when I actually started doing the weaving and exploring for myself, I found that I was wrong in those ideas that I had. So I want to share a little bit of that with you today. This video is brought to you by Weaving on a Table Loom. This is an online class that takes you from the very beginning, including setting up your new table loom and putting it all together, to the very first steps that you'll need to undertake to get weaving on your table loom. I've had so much awesome feedback from this class from weavers who had no idea how to start on their table loom, and by the end of the course they were weaving something beautiful and absolutely thrilled with themselves. I'm going to leave a link to that class down below so that you can check it out if it's of interest to you. So in the last video that I already mentioned, I was working on this sampler and I had it all treadled so that I could weave these rose shapes. You may recall that if you saw the last video. Now I'm going to weave a little bit on this while I'm chatting to you, just like I did in the last video. That means I can get two things done at once, which is great. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about was, I mentioned at the start of the video that I had some preconceived ideas about multi-shaft weaving. And one of those was, I loved the idea that a multi-shaft loom was a kind of set and go idea. What I mean by that is, once you had all the threading, you were set with your pattern, and then you just had to weave the pattern. Now, I thought that was great to begin with, but I also thought, well, if I have my pattern set, I've threaded for a certain pattern, then that means that I can only thread that pattern. And so whatever warp I put on, I'm committed to weaving that pattern for the entirety of the warp, no matter what it was. Let's say that I wanted to weave, I don't know, 4 tea towels, and I wanted each one to look different. I thought, well, the only way that I can really make them look different is by changing the color of the weft. But as I began to actually multi-shaft weave and start to understand the concepts a little bit more just by doing it, I realized that the threading is not the kind of commitment that I presumed it was. And this project, this sampler I'm working on here, is a living example of that. So I did make this draft in my weaving software, and I made it to specifically weave the rose shapes, as I already showed you. But then when I was done weaving my rose shapes, because what I really wanted to do was figure out the placement of designs on the runner that I'm designing, and I had done that and I was happy with that, but I had quite a bit of warp left over. And this is where the fun of sampling really comes in. I've got warp left, well, rather than waste it, I'm going to play with it. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. So what I did with my draft, and I'm going to show you the draft on the screen as it is now for this piece that I'm working on. I'm going to show you a close-up of this too, so don't worry if you want to see it a little bit closer and can't just yet. I will do that in a moment. But so the draft you see on the screen, what I did was I rearranged the threading. So the first thing that I did for the threading is I selected Trompe as writ in my weaving program. This is a great thing about a weaving program is, well, yes, you can draw up this draft on paper, absolutely, and it's very good for you to do that, to understand the draft. But once you have a bit of an understanding of drafts, you don't necessarily want to draw it up on paper every time. So with the click of a button, I can completely change the threading on a draft if I want to. So I chose Trompe as writ, and if you don't know what that means, it means that the threading that I had chosen for this particular draft, because no, I can't change the threading once it's done, that I am committed to that particular threading. I arranged it so that the treadling was exactly the same as the threading, and that's known as trompe-l'oeil, and sometimes you'll see it as it'll be written as drawn in, and it just means that you're to use the same treadling as your threading, which is kind of an interesting way of doing a pattern. The only difference here being that I also have to incorporate my tabby. So that's not on the draft that you're seeing on the screen. I usually, if I have a draft that requires tabby in between pattern picks, like for any overshot, I don't put the tabby in the draft because it's just going to make the draft really, really long, and I just know that I'm going to have to do tabby anyway. So then once I had the same threading, I did have a little problem, and that is that because my threading is in blocks, and the blocks are shafts 1, 2, and 3 and 4, I was only treadling the 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in the original draft, if you looked above shafts 2 and 3, there's actually nothing there because I wasn't using those shafts on their own. So my way around that, and also just as a further experiment for treadling a new pattern, I made it so that the treadling was a typical twill treadling, and that is shafts 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and 1 and 4. So now when I had a number 2 come up, then I knew that was shafts 2 and 3, and when I had a 4 come up, I knew that was shafts 1 and 4. And so that has really changed the look of the pattern. So I can still see the rose shapes, but there are other things happening that tie the pattern together that are really interesting and really exciting. Now, when you're experimenting on the loom like this, one thing to look out for is your floats, because if you're playing around with treadling, you will sometimes find that some of your floats are too long, and sometimes you'll see it on the front and you'll think, oh, that looks fantastic, I love it. But then when you look on the back side, you'll have long floats. So that's just a little tip for something to look out for. The easy way to do that is to just weave a little bit and then have a look on the underside, or if it's too difficult to look on the underside because of the way your loom's set up, you can pop your phone underneath and take a photo. That's an easy way to do it. And that will tell you definitely whether you have too long of floats on the back or not. Also, if you have a weaving program and you can put all of the figures in for your draft, you can select, at least Weave It Pro has this option, you can select it to actually find the floats for you, so you don't even have to have that kind of guesswork. But if you're happy to just do it yourself and have a go, that's a really good way to do it. So I've ended up with quite a long treadling sequence. It's actually 40 changes, 40 shaft changes, and that's not counting the tabby, because that's how long the threading sequence is. So that's another thing about if you are weaving trompe-l'oeil, you might end up with a fairly long treadling sequence, depending on how long your threading sequence was. I'm just going to weave a little bit more of this, and then I'm going to show you up close what is happening. And I'm almost needing to advance my warp as well. So even though I'm not going to use this as a project, this particular pattern, I know for another time, because I'll keep this sample and I'll keep the weaving draft that I made for it, I know that it's another option for something that's quite different. And looking at this, you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's monk's belt, because monk's belt you typically think of as the building blocks, the built up blocks of weft. And here I'm weaving single picks of the pattern weft rather than building up the blocks. I could also experiment with building up the blocks with this particular pattern if I wanted to. But because I worked this purely as a trompe-l'oeil pattern, this is how it's turned out. So let's have a close look at it now. As I pointed out before, the blocks are there, and it's funny because when I'm looking at this pattern just in real life, I'm seeing a lot more of wavy patterns and stuff like that rather than the blocks. Like the blocks don't jump out to me as much, but when I look at them through the camera screen, I can see the blocks really clearly. So that's an interesting thing. But anyway, this is what we've got. Because I'm doing the singles, we've got space between the pattern picks where we've had our tabby. So that creates this space. It also creates a lot of little dots where our pattern pick's just traveling through, because the pattern pick is thicker than the tabby and the warp thread. And then what I really like about this is the traveling lines, or the crooked lines, that they're crooked, but they seem so well ordered. They give like a real movement to the look of the piece. I'm going to show this also from a different angle, because this is not necessarily the best angle to see that movement, but it really jumps out at you when you're looking at it. And here's just another angle just to have a look at those lines, the waves. I find that really very visually pleasing, and especially up here when the lines travel through. Another thing you can do, this is just another idea that's come to me, is if you find some elements in a pattern that you particularly like. For example, I can see that these zigzag lines here at the end, they only occur at a certain part of the pattern. So I can look at the treadling sequence that I've already done, and I can determine what it is or which picks it was that made those lines. And I could increase those lines and repeat them and make them more of a feature of the pattern if I wanted to. So that's really my point with this video, is there's just so much that you can do just by playing around and picking out things that you like and doing more of that thing. You can see how different, if you can just see here, this is to the last pattern. They're both really beautiful, but so very different, but still on the same threading. And I just got this by playing around and changing things around a little bit. You know, there are lots of rules in weaving. I always say this, there are lots of rules, but the rules can totally be bent, and you can find out how far you can bend those rules by playing around and just pushing those boundaries a little bit. Again, I will say about samplers, if you put a sampler on, all you've got to lose is a little bit of time and a little bit of yarn. But even if the sampler turns out completely terrible and nothing like you thought that it would, you've still spent the time and you've shown yourself what is not going to work. One more thing before I go. If you are sampling something like a monk's belt or an overshot that has the background tabby, it's a really good one to experiment with, because there are times where you might be experimenting with another type of pattern and you take it off the loom and you find you've got lots of floats, and basically there's no integrity to the fabric and the whole thing just starts to fall apart, or it goes totally wonky and it's not usable, and you realize that you're never going to weave that particular pattern in that way again. But with any pattern that has a tabby included after each pattern pick, the fabric has real integrity because it is actually plain weave fabric with the pattern picks introduced. So even if I pulled each of these pattern picks out right now, the fabric would still be okay, and it would still be a fabric because it's just a plain weave fabric. So that's a little plus for your experimentation, especially if you're going to be using floats. There is so much to talk about in weaving, and I could really talk about it all day long. So I appreciate you joining me, listening in, and hopefully picking up little bits and pieces and learning along the way. The reason I do what I do is because I love to share my passion for weaving, and I so appreciate that there are so many of you who also share that passion. Until next time, happy weaving.